Wave your hand.
Hi.
Robin's our CEO and president. Um, and then, of course, we have Brian here as well, who's going to be our primary host. Um, so we have people calling in from all over the world in all sorts of time zones. So we're grateful for everyone who is joining us live today. As Robin mentioned, we're recording this webinar, so it'll be accessible to anyone, everyone after the fact, and just to make it so that people can watch it on their own time with their own internet availability. And it will be available on our website. This is our first webinar of what we hope will be many. We want these webinars to serve as opportunities for us to create networks of learning for our partners, whether that be our implementing partners, our corporate partners, our funding partners, and much, much more. This is meant to be an active dialogue and conversation. So we really encourage you to think about what we're talking about and chime in with comments or thoughts or questions in the chat. Think about how this relates to your work, your context, your colleagues, your beneficiaries, because we will have a discussion after the presentation where we really hope to create some meaningful dialogue that incites some interesting thoughts. So please contribute to the conversation. So the first step is to put your thoughts in the chat box, and we will take those, anything that's put in the chat, we'll put into a slide that we'll all review at the end. So this is really meant to be collaborative. Brian Love will be our host. He is our Operations and Strategy Director. He has a PhD in plant sciences and has a background as a plant breeder, and has worked in both the public and private sector in regard to plant sciences, including stints at the Gates Foundation and more. And I know Alan, one of our board members, will also be co-hosting this webinar as well, and he is a plant breeder as well, and I will let Brian introduce him a bit more. I'll take it over to you, Brian.
Right. Thanks, Georgia. And I'm just seeing in the comments that some folks had to re-register to access this meeting. So I don't know, Georgia, Robin, if in the background you can maybe ping folks with a link and see if that helps more people join us as we go through this deck and have discussion. So thanks everyone for coming today. Today's webinar is about improved crop varieties. Seed Programs is involved in distributing quality adapted seed to communities in need, and these are often improved varieties of various sorts. So we thought it would be good to talk about this topic, how they're created, and then the challenges of enabling access to them, which is what we've been doing for about a quarter century now. Agenda, just for structure, we'll do introduction and background. We'll talk about crop improvement in terms of research and development. We'll talk about crop improvement in terms of delivery, and then get into questions and discussion. A little bit about your guides today. This is myself and Alan. Georgia, you already went over sort of some of the basic details. Most of my experience in research and development is in timber species, cereals, and vegetables. Fun fact about me, I'm a university dropout, and this is how I got into plant breeding. I took a bus from Montreal to Mexico and ended up in a community in Ayutla Mije, where Mije farmers taught me about what they were growing, and that was very intriguing to me. So I wondered, what can you do with this diversity? What can we build? What's the next step? Which led me to breeding. So I rushed back to university, finished a degree in anthropology, and then actually found a university that would accept me into a graduate program for plant breeding, which was a bit of a trick, but it happened, and now I'm here. So that's a bit about me. Alan, if you want to say a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My background is also in plant breeding in the public and private sector. That's how I met Brian. Initially, we were both working down at CIMMYT, the International Ag Research Center, focused on breeding corn and wheat. I've done breeding in field corn, in tropical lowland corn, maize at CIMMYT, and then also the latter part of my career as a tomato breeder. And then, yeah, the fun fact I put in there, since we're talking about improved crop varieties, probably the first improved variety that I can recall in my life as a child was the tomato variety Early Girl. My father grew it in his garden. It's a very common variety to be grown in the U.S. And I was lucky enough when I became a plant breeder, a tomato breeder for Monsanto, which is now Bayer. They had inherited that variety from peto seeds that developed it, and I was lucky enough to do some breeding work and develop a new variety of Early Girl that's out and available today. So it's pretty fun to see that sort of work in color. Yep, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Thanks, Alan. A little bit about seed programs. I think everybody here knows seed programs very well. In fact, we have a few past board members on the call. So our mission, it's been to improve food security, strengthen communities, and cultivate sustainable livelihoods through agriculture. This is primarily through access to seed and knowledge. Founded in 1998, so coming up, it is a quarter century that we've been doing this work. And again, enabling seed access in these last mile geographies. And we do this through local implementing partners. So we are a very lean organization that focuses on making sure donation dollars go to the beneficiaries in the field as much as possible. And we're very privileged to have a number of implementing partners on this call today. Why are we hosting this webinar? Georgia went a little bit over this already, but personal interests, we want to enable community discussion, we want to foster knowledge sharing, and we also want to understand the challenges that implementing partners are facing in the field. We want to facilitate networking going forward and offering more mentoring with associates. So implementing partners who need specific expertise in particular areas, making that connection. And of course, we're all stronger when we work together. So a little bit about crop improvement, research and development, just some background here. So, at a basic level, what is agriculture? It's what we grow and it's how we grow it. And what we grow is the genetics. So those are the crops and the varieties that we plant in the field. And the agronomy is how we grow it. So, the water, the fertilizer, the weed control, all of those things that go into growing that crop. A little bit about knowledge underpinnings. This always, when I write it out, I'm like, wow, like there is a history to this and it goes pretty deep. So, back just at the beginning of the 1800s, a fellow named Malthus identified the threat, which is essentially if you have a situation in which your population is growing faster than your food supply, you're going to run into starvation. And this is, sort of discussed as geometric population growth versus linear food supply growth. And so this really put, the need for agriculture that is productive and resilient at scale on the map. And Darwin provided a framework for evolution, which allowed us to understand that we could interact with these crops in a way that we could select them. He opens up origins of species in part with a discussion of horse breeding. So it's something that people were actively doing, but not something that was maybe formally incorporated. Mendel, of course, provided work which we understood the pathway to doing this with regards to what are called qualitative traits or traits that are controlled by single genes that are easy to observe. And so this is inheritance, and we sort of understood we can select for these things in this more formal way, which people had already been doing, but just sort of formalizing the understanding. De Vries provided a mechanism for it, understanding that there were genes behind inheritance. Schull, later on at the beginning of the 1900s, sort of identified that we can make hybrids and that there's value in this in terms of enabling access to high performance. And Fisher put in place the way to know, which is statistics. And so before, with all the environmental variation that was going on and the other types of error in measurement that you have, it wasn't always clear what was the best thing to pick. And so he enabled that. And since then, we've had like very formalized scientific approaches to crop improvement and the generation of improved varieties. And this has benefited us, incredibly. Essentially, it's allowed us to work with nature to enable human-directed evolution to feed humanity. And without this, we wouldn't be here today. So sometimes there's this question of like, is this even real, right? Like this is some sort of if we were just doing what we had always done in the past, we'd still be fine. Thank you for all of these intellectual contributions, but they're really not necessary. And this just isn't the case. Crop improvement is real, and it in fact preserves the environment and reduces dependency. One of the most sort of famous examples of this is the Green Revolution. And Norman Borlaug was breeding wheat, and he developed short-statured, high-yielding, photoinsensitive types of wheat. Photoinsensitive meaning whenever you plant it, it'll still flower regardless of daylight length at a set point in time. And these wheat varieties that he developed essentially prevented famine in India, which had a rapidly growing population and didn't have its food supply growing at the same rate because of production being held back by yield. Also mentioning that Norman Borlaug did a lot of work on disease tolerance, so these were disease tolerant varieties. And what you see here is what happened is these varieties were introduced in 1964, 1965, sort of the beginning, mid 60s. And you see these trends here. These trends could have flattened, but instead they ticked up, and they ticked up faster than population growth. And what that enabled was that land use could stay flat, which is preserving the environment, and also imports could stay flat, which is increasing resilience. You don't have to spend your money on foreign capital exchange to acquire food imports from somewhere else, which is absolutely devastating to your economy. And just to show, like, we could show these charts for many different places, but in the US, this is what has happened with maize or corn, where essentially for a long, long time, we see very flat production. And then when we see the introduction of sort of scientific breeding practices and the adoption and use of improved varieties, we see a very strong, sustained uptick, which is super important given where corn ends up in the US food system, which is it feeds animals, it provides starch, it provides sugar, it's used in plastics, it's used in ethanol to drive cars. There's so many end uses for this that without that productivity, we wouldn't be able to have the systems that we have today and the options for other systems as well. Alan, do you want to say anything about this? I know that you're familiar with this history and also worked specifically at CIMMYT for a period of time where, Norman Borlaug essentially ended up, CIMMYT was sort of founded out of the organization that he worked in when he developed these wheat varieties.
Right. I mean, that slide is a really powerful slide to show you the impact that that breeding has had. And I, as we've discussed many times, I think an interesting component of it is sort of the interaction between agronomy and plant breeding. And a fair bit of those initial yield gains came from on the agronomic side of the introduction of nitrogen to grow field crops. But they'd sort of known that you could increase yield by adding nitrogen, but there was a lot of secondary negative effects of that. Oftentimes, in the case of wheat, and I believe also in rice, that you'd have much more severe lodging. So it wasn't really yield that could be captured; it would be lost. And so, with Norman Borlaug and breeding for shorter stature wheat and shorter stature crops, they were able to sort of support that additional grain load on the plant and make it harvestable. And I've always thought that was quite an interesting part about plant breeding, and that interface between agronomic practices and breeding. And sometimes you can get really big step changes by taking in consideration both. But yeah, I mean the foundation of the green revolution really started with Norman Borlaug and wheat, and extended over into rice, and really converted a lot of countries in South Asia and Asia from importing grain importing countries and at risk to famine to actually exporting grain. Pretty amazing story in plant breeding.
Yeah, agreed. So what is this plant breeding thing? You know, there's just 3 key steps. There's a lot of nuance and specifics, and we could do whole webinars on any of those specifics. But just in general, what you do is you create variation. So you cross 2 different materials together. In this case, we have one with the brown leaf that has some disease susceptibility, but it also has really high yield, this rice, given the number of panicles and how full those panicles are. And here we have another variety or line of rice that doesn't have that disease issue, but which has you know, fewer panicles and so less yield. And you cross these together and you create progeny, so all of these children, and they combine together these traits. Some of them are traits like the ones Mendel you worked with, which are qualitative traits like the disease resistance that are sort of present or absent and controlled by very few genes. And some of them are quantitative traits like yield, which are much more complex and controlled by a number of genes. And so you then see in the progeny how these get sorted into different combinations. And if we just look at a single plant, we don't really know its potential. We're growing it in one environment and it's one plant. So you plant plots of all of these different children in different environments, and you measure them in order to understand what their real potential is in terms of these quantitative traits, and also observe cases where they're challenged by disease and what their reaction is. And then you use statistics developed by Fisher to look at all of those items and pick one that fits your needs best. And so here, in going through that process, a line or genetics or materials of variety has been identified that is both high yielding and is disease free. And that then becomes a line or genetics that is recycled back into the next cycle of breeding, where it is again crossed with materials that have traits or characters of interest in order to continue to improve these materials. And Alan, I mean, you've been doing this for decades. Anything you would like to comment here or clarify?
Yeah, I think that's pretty straightforward explanation.
Okay. Yeah, you do this over and over again. I mean, maybe one point here is like, I love being a breeder. Alan loves being a breeder. We get together, we talk about this ad nauseum. Other people present, such as, you know, friends and family, tune out. But breeding is not for everyone. You do this over and over and over again for decades, and you're throwing out like 99.9% of your material. So it always feels a little bit like you're failing. And you need to wait a long time to know if you're successful. And as Alan pointed out, he's been successful. He's developed varieties that now you and I enjoy in the store and feed people around the world. But it takes time and it takes dedication. It's not for the faint of heart, for sure. So let's talk about delivery. So it's one thing to develop a variety, but it's another thing to deliver seed of that variety to farms. And so one phrase that's always stuck to me is that the last mile to delivery is the first mile to success. So the success isn't developing the variety. That's a requirement that you got to do. But the real success comes when it gets to the field. And this is not a trivial process. And another thing that has stuck with me is that Norman Borlaug always said you can't eat publications. And so you can create a new variety and you can write about it and you can publish in peer-reviewed journals from an academic point of view, but until it gets to the field, it really hasn't done anything. And in terms of getting to the field and this non-trivial process, there's 3 steps that stand out. The first is access. The second is using the variety. And then the third is adoption. And it's really important to remember that farming families, when they go through this process, they're the ones that bear the effort, the risk, and the cost of all of this. And so, regardless of who's doing it, you need to support people in appropriate ways to get through this process, without, essentially doing damage to their household or their livelihoods. And that's what seed programs is set up to do. We're set up to provide access, provide knowledge, through implementing partners, then facilitate use, and then work with people to understand whether these materials are meeting their needs, and essentially adopt them into their farming practice as part of their livelihood strategy for feeding themselves. Alan, anything else you'd like to comment there about this process? I mean, I've been very fortunate to work in larger organizations where other people take care of this process of getting varieties that I've developed to the field. And it is not easy work for sure.
Right. I mean, I was going to mention it if we get to some of the specifics of tomato breeding later on. It was going to be a point I was going to emphasize, but it really, what you mentioned, risk from the farmer. I think that is, in regard to new variety adoption, is not trivial, because the farmers often have an immediate economic risk in purchasing new seed, having a reliable source of that seed if they actually identify a variety that is adding to their livelihoods, and it's a time cost as well. And of course, if you're dependent on it as a subsistence farmer for feeding your family, it's a risk in that level as well, that you may be trying to grow a crop that's not going to be as reliable as the one that you're familiar with. And I think that it maybe as complicated the breeding part is of developing new varieties, that piece of adoption, and what the farmers and partner organizations have to go through in trying to identify a better variety out there for those farmers. It's not easy, and that definitely is something that I think SPI and its partners has a key role in helping sort of ease that cost of entry for farmers.
Yeah, this work is never going away, and it's not easy to do. So there's more than enough space for multiple different people working on this. I know there's a colleague from Echo in Fort Myers, Florida, on the call, and they also do some of this work. There's more than one organization out there that is supporting people through this struggle. So what to do? This is how seed programs, we think about this. We think about the first step as dissemination. We need to get seed to farms. There's a whole lot of caveats and specific minutia here in terms of it's got to be the right seed on the right acres with the right farming practices, planted at the right time. And that's not easy. There is some wiggle room in there, but you need to have the appropriate quality, appropriate adaptation, getting to the right places at the right time. You need feedback. So you need to get the farmer perspective about how this worked for them. You can have all the information in the world from testing over multiple years and publications, and other information suggesting that the variety is good in many different ways and was appropriate. But until you hear back from the actual farmers and what they think, you really don't know. And they'll identify things that are good and worked, and they'll identify things that weren't so good and didn't work. And depending on those combination of things, they'll decide whether they want to continue to grow that variety or not. And then comes in the perspective of, like, how do they get access to the seed? Are they recycling their own seed when that works for them and is appropriate, or do they have access to a seed supply chain where they can purchase seed when that's a better option for them. And then you refine and you adjust dissemination based on the feedback that you get. And one of the key things here is leverage, and we mentioned that a little bit in terms of like feedback and choosing to adopt something. Many crops, they are what you would call pure line OPVs of selfing varieties, and these are self-replicating essentially. So if you harvest the grain, and you don't, select a bunch of off types, you basically have seed for the next season. And this is a way of scaling access in terms of farmers who are going to appreciate a variety, replant that variety, and potentially provide that variety to, friends, family, other folks connected to them in their community or in other communities, so that others also try the variety and then similarly scale it onwards. Some varieties are hybrid varieties, and when those are not cannot be clonally propagated, such as cassava or some other crops, then when those crops self, the genetics begin to segregate. And so there, if you want to maintain the performance, you really need to go back and buy hybrid seed. And creating hybrid seed is it's complex and costly and best done by experts that are dedicated to that task in terms of specialization, and then to purchase that seed. And in those cases, adoption requires making sure that the performance of those varieties is such that it can generate income in a way that you can purchase the seed in the next year. People also do recycle hybrid seed, but the performance deteriorates over time. Alan, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I think that was pretty good.
So what are the approaches for effective dissemination then? Networks are key. I think utilizing existing networks such as like education networks, so school systems, health systems, even sort of religious communities where there are connections, I think are very useful. This to disseminate seed and knowledge so that folks know what they're getting and what to do with it. Demonstrations are important, so making sure that there's some reasonably managed centralized demonstrations in large plots that people can visit and see, along with any of the seed that they might be planting on their own farm. And this can generate discussion. So, people will come and see a plot that's maybe planted at a school or at a health clinic or on a farm or at a church or a mosque, and can discuss what their experience on farm is versus what they're seeing done in these demonstration plots. Sometimes when you travel around, you'll see plots with signs, and they'll be in a farmer's field, and there'll be an entity that's distributing that seed that will have planted strips, and then they will be indicating to people what varieties those are, and people can go and see them. There'll be field days, those sorts of things. Field days is a little bit speaking about engagement. You need customer guidance. We've talked about this, but there's also ways to source this now that weren't available previously. So with digital age, with smartphones, with computers, with internet connectivity, it's really important to use those tools to get feedback from folks. And it's amazing what you can do now. I mean, you can take a picture of something, you can type in a little bit about what's going on, and this can all be received, stored in the cloud, and then analyzed as well, both for geographic position, timing of year, so like a temporal position, and then even some image analysis and textual analysis of what people are saying. And then you use that information to better target how you're going to distribute seed and what you're going to distribute. And you can also provide feedback to breeding programs about what's working and what's not, and what the issues appear to be. Breeding programs take a long time. That's biologically rate limited activity because you have to do crosses, you have to wait through the seasons, you have to do the testing. But that information is also important so that over time, these varieties that are developed are more and more appropriate and on target for the user population of farmers. And then you just iterate on this. This is much like plant breeding. You do it over and over and over again. It's very important. Alan, anything to add here?
Yeah, I just say I think the demonstration plots are a really powerful tool for seed adoption and deciding if you're going to displace you know, a current variety with an improved variety. And it can be at the most informal level where you're just comparing the original variety with a new one on a given farm. And you know, it gives it's a snapshot in time and a snapshot in location, but it gives you, you know, a very strong head-to-head comparison between the two for the farmer to, you know, start that process of, is this going to add value over what I currently have? And then, you know, of course, up to those larger, more formal demonstration plots that may be, you know, replicated on research stations as well. But this is something that, you know, is used in the breeding process as well, even if you don't have, especially in vegetable breeding, where you may not have replications to be deciding, is this better for these traits in this variety than the other? But when you can look at them, you know, directly adjacent to each other, the two varieties that you're comparing, it can be quite strong in helping you make that decision of the value that you may have there.
Agreed. Yeah, really, really important step. So now we're into questions and discussion. I feel like much of what has been communicated in the chat are more sort of folks providing information about who they are and where they are, which is fantastic. And I've seen some comments from folks, which are great. And so we can kick off questions and discussion here. And then if we have time, we can get into a little bit about tomato breeding, which Alan is an expert in and has some additional slides here to share if we get to the point where it makes sense to move on from discussion into another topic. So with that, Georgia, anything you want to highlight for discussions or people that you want to invite to ask a question? And then just to note that typically with Zoom, on the options that you have, there's one called reactions, and if you click on that, which has like a little emoji face on it, you can raise your hand, which is also a way to sort of signal that you've got a question that you want to ask. So Georgia, over to you.
Yeah, I think the first one is, you know, are there general questions and clarifications? I know Brian went over a lot of material, and for those of us who are not plant breeders, there might be just some general, hey, can you expand upon this? So, and then after that, I think we'd love to ask, you know, are there varieties? I know we have some program partners in the room from a variety of countries, and are there varieties that you really like that you're using now? And then we'll go into some of these other questions. But I guess to start with, are there any general questions that anybody has? And you can raise your hand in the chat if you have anything to say. Okay. Oh, Michael you raised your hand. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Good afternoon to everyone from Nigeria. Am I audible?
Hi, Michael. It's
We
good to
can
see
hear you well, Michael.
All right, thank you so much to our partner SPI for this unique gathering. You know, we've been in connection with SPI for many years now through different organizations, and today we are here with our our personal groups and that we're implementing projects that were supported from the SPI. So we are so grateful to SPI for the numerous support they have been giving to Africans in Africa, more especially Liberia. So we had a lot of issues that we face in the agriculture sector in our country. So everything is just dragging and that needs key attention. One has to do with the extension study, like I mentioned in the comment section. You know, government alone cannot do everything. So government will need private sector organizations to bridge the gap that have been left between the farmers, down to the government institution and research center. But how can this work? It had to be done through extension training. But then we see that there is no support, no minimal support from government agency or other organizations that really want to push the private sector to be able to go as far as getting extension services to farmers. Because if farmers produce on a good guidance, I think they will have the quantitative and better yield they deserve. That will be able to improve their production and their living standard. Another issue has to do with the agronomic practices. You know, you will get the best or the quality planting materials. But if you don't know what mechanism to put into place, that would be exactly a waste. For example, there are many farmers in Liberia who don't even know how to produce tomatoes because they believe that tomatoes come with a lot of breeding, it comes with a lot of diseases and pests. So they want to produce it, but how they don't have the technical know-how, they don't have the skill to go about producing the tomatoes. So they had that fear in their mind. They don't want to put their money into purchasing 1 can of tomato, 50 can of tomato for $40, $50, and then at the end, it be all losses for them. So when they had the extension services at their disposal that will be guiding them through the process, I think our Liberian farmers will be ready to take the initiative to produce high-value vegetable crops that will be able to minimize the importation of foodstuff from all neighboring countries around. So I think we starting talking about the breeding of crops. You know, our research center in Liberia is also highlighting that we cannot even be able to breed a single crop that will be having new breed in our system. Everything is just about trial. So I think when Liberians have the opportunity to learn this idea about breeding new variety of different crops, it really help our agricultural sector to move forward. So these are points I just wanted to highlight from my end.
Thanks, Michael. Georgia?
Oh, I was just going to say, I think something that you bring up that's really important is that gap between delivery of varieties and how it's implemented with farmers, right? And in the gaps that exist in terms of not only service delivery of getting good seed into the hand of farmers, but making sure they have the resources to support them in that transition of utilizing a new variety. And I know many of our partners, they're on the front lines of trying to make that happen, right? Making sure extension services are available, making sure resources are available. And you bring up a lot of good points, Michael.
And Michael, one of the thoughts that it triggers is Alan mentioned that you can get these really incredible gains when you pair a good variety with good agronomy, but you can also take a good expensive variety and pair it with bad agronomy. Which isn't necessarily the fault of the farmer. Sometimes, like you point out, they don't have access to the resources that they need or the know-how that they need. And you can spend a lot of money on that seed and it will produce nothing because of disease or insect pests or lack of fertility or lack of water. So you really need to put both of those two things together to be successful. And in cases where agronomy is the main limiting factor, it really makes sense to work on that more and first before accessing varieties that may perform very well in terms of high yield and that sort of thing. There's also cases, of course, where there are diseases that are not easily controlled agronomically. And in these cases, you need a genetic solution to that disease problem. Otherwise, that crop potentially will be not cultivable in your area. And here in Davis, California, we have a local example where hops used to be grown locally. And then disease moved in and it annihilated the crop here, and it's not grown here anymore. It is starting to come back, but unless that disease pathogen has moved on, or you have a resistant variety, you're not going to be able to cultivate it. And so just sort of putting these things together through the knowledge of, implementing partners that are supporting farmers for each specific region in each specific point of time is important in terms of targeting what's going to make the most sense. Alan, tomatoes diseases are important. Any thoughts or comments there?
I mean, it's interesting in vegetable crops, there are a lot more required traits or must-have traits that you don't see as much in cereal crops, where it's sort of incremental gains in yield that is the focus. But many examples, it doesn't matter. You could have a variety of tomato that will reliably yield 5 times as much as the standard variety. But if it is missing one of those required traits, and an aesthetic trait, or in the case of a disease-resistant trait, the farmers won't even, they don't want to even look at it. So yeah, of course, like the disease resistance is incredibly important for a tomato crop and deciding on what varieties you'll be growing as a farmer.
So Michael just raised his hand, but Tim also brought up a great question in the comment box, and I'm going to read that one out loud. Are there some basic selection practices farmers can implement themselves to collect quality seeds from their gardens and fields? Also wondering if you can comment on ways NGOs and development workers can reduce the burden of risk to farmers.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is yes. There's a number of different practices, and I think Tim, Echo is working on this, right, and promoting access to good practices for saving seed in appropriate ways. It really depends on your crop and your farmer cohort and what's going to work for them. So it's always nice if they have choice, where they can either save seed if that works best for them, or access seed if they need more, or feel like it's cost and effort prohibitive for them to save seed. Maybe Tim, you'd like to comment a little bit on what Echo is doing, if you want to unmute and talk about that, and then we can talk about like things that can be done to sort of buy down risk or mitigate risk by folks working in the field that have resources that are trying to benefit farming families. So Tim, I don't know if you'd be able to unmute and share your experience and your thoughts, but that'd be great.
Yeah, I think, can you hear me okay?
Hear you well, Tim.
I think our strength is more along the lines of storing seeds and seed banking. When it comes to breeding and making selections, that's where we feel like we can learn a lot from others. And we have interacted in the past with groups like Hope Seeds and yourselves. Mike Mueller taught us a little bit about just making some selections. I honestly don't remember the specific practices, but yeah, so that's a little bit of, from our perspective. I can, as far as the risk question, I can recall when I spent some time with Echo in Haiti, we would invite farmers to grow. We did variety trials on the project site. And then we did field days. We got input from farmers about which varieties they liked. And then we multiplied seeds of those varieties. And then the last step was giving samples of those seeds to farmers to try on a small portion of their own field. That way they weren't risking a lot. And then if they succeeded with that small plot, then they could multiply the seeds themselves as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, often that demonstration that's centralized is useful, and then, providing people with access to small quantities of seed that they can grow alongside their current crops and varieties to try it for themselves without, planting their whole farm to it is really key. I mean, we've seen cases where this can be a disaster if things are over promoted and then don't do well. Especially this has happened in India where there can be like very aggressive seed sales. People can switch over to, a different variety. I think cotton is an example of this. The seed is expensive. They take out loans. They buy the seed. The weather doesn't cooperate. There's things that aren't understood about that variety for specific locations and specific conditions, and it fails, and now they're in debt. And this is not a good thing. So you want to be very respectful and mindful of going through a process that enables folks to experience things at low risk, and then make decisions that work for themselves. Alan, any thoughts on that? I mean, you've been involved in this in a number of different settings. You're muted too if you're trying to say something.
Yeah, I think you covered it.
And then just maybe about breeding, like you can always select things in the field, but there needs to be variation to select on, and you can have, like, there's these participatory breeding types of projects that have gone on and a lot of published literature about it. And there are examples of people who are growers developing varieties. There's some examples in onion, there's probably examples in tomato, but you always want to be investing also in centralized breeding that's dedicated to it and has the resources to put into using the scientific tools to do the breeding rather than relying on farmers to bear that burden. But lots of good examples too of like collections of diversity coming from farmers that then gets incorporated into breeding programs, because there's a lot more material planted out on the landscape than there is in a specific centralized breeding program. Alan, I don't know if you have any examples you'd want to share from tomato about where variation and useful traits come from the landscape and then get incorporated into a breeding program and then go back out onto the landscape in a improved form.
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of examples of those types of favorable traits coming from land races that are being grown as crops. In tomato, it's more of a case where a lot of that useful genetics and useful traits have come from related wild species that have been collected and then evaluated, and most of the disease resistance traits actually that are in cultivated tomato have come from wild species of tomato that in many academic institutions, they identified those traits and did the process of integrated them in, and then they can become just like any other trait that's selected on by breeding programs going forward. But yeah.
Davis is a great example of that too, because there's the tomato collection here that a lot of the wild species that have those disease resistances came from. Also here at UC Davis, there's work that's been done on chickpea, where very high protein has come in from some, ancient land races that are substantially diverged from cultivated chickpea. And, they're producing like high protein flours from chickpea for all sorts of, nutritious foods. So, lots of great examples of where there's some improvement that's been done on the landscape at scale. It then can enter a formalized breeding program and make contributions to create improved varieties that then go back out onto the landscape for use by farming families. Georgia, I know we're getting a little bit towards the end of our webinar time here, but maybe there's time for a few more questions and then maybe some closing comments.
Absolutely. It seems like there haven't been any direct questions in the chat right now. So if anybody else has one more direct question to ask our hosts and plant breeders, please let me know. And then if not, I think this, one of the questions up on our discussion board of, you know, how, even if we don't discuss them today, would be nice to just think about, and maybe we can come together at a later point or have a forum and discussion on, you know, really thinking critically about the vegetable seed you have. It's not the only vegetable seed that can exist, right? So thinking about, you know, what are the varieties that you have right now? What do you like about them? What do you don't like about them? And I like this question of how and where do you fit into this process and access of improved crop varieties. I think this is good food for thought to be thinking about as everyone here is somewhere in the value chain of seed, right? Whether they're helping create it or using it to grow nutritious food. I think we have one hand up. Dr. Tamiko, do you want to unmute and have a comment?
Sure. Thank you so much. I just want to say thanks, first of all, for this wonderful webinar. It's been incredibly informative. And for someone like me who's sort of pivoting and going back into the direction of the seed industry, this information is very helpful to understand the state of the art really in breeding. And I would love to suggest another forum or conversations, because I've written at least 7 or 8 questions that are discussion topics that we really could, you know, dig in and have some sort of juicy discussion about, you know, what is being done, what can be done further. And my question that I'm raising now, where does SPI fit into all of this? We've discussed, you know, these advances in improved crop varieties and so forth, and we had a question and a comment about the challenges associated with getting these improved varieties as aid, but not necessarily having the accompaniment necessary to be able to get the greatest value or use out of those seeds and those new crop varieties. So my question is, along this value chain and link, what is the greatest challenge for SPI at this point in helping the partners and others that SPI serves?
Tamiko, that's a great question. Tamiko, I was wondering if it was you, and then when I
Yes,
heard
it
your
is me.
voice, I knew it was you. So,
It is me.
Tamiko was our chair for a while and on the board for many years, and was Tamiko Gaines at that point.
I really was.
Now Dr. Chalamet. So,
Yay.
thanks
And I'd
for
love to
joining,
come back.
Tamiko.
So if you have any room on the board, I'd love to return.
Awesome. We'll have to bring that up and see what's
Sure.
possible.
Mhm.
Also, Tamiko was based in Davis for a while, so lots of connections there.
Mhm.
Tamiko, that's a whole discussion. So just to say, there are many challenges, and some of them are you know, bigger pinch points than others. You know, there's a whole challenge of just getting seed that is appropriate into the right geography at the right time. You know, that's sort of the challenge that was, you know, the basis, bread and butter of what seed programs had been doing historically. You know, we
Sure.
recognize we need to move beyond that to the challenge of knowledge and that being available in the right sort of format at the right time, you know, for the right circumstances. There's the challenge of sourcing seed afterwards. And so, you know, it's great in cases where, you know, farmers are going to scale this themselves, but even then, a farmer, you know, scaling a variety that, you know, is a pure line variety that, you know, breeds or selfs true through the generations, that's difficult to reach people. And so really sort of partnering with entities, whether they're seed companies or government organizations or NGOs, to do seed production and targeted dissemination and make available larger quantities of seed to meet demand. And it's all a process. I mean, it's biologically rate limited. It's not like I can write some code, run my software, and do 30 iterations in a day of improvement. You have to grow a season, and this takes months and months and months, and then you have to learn from that, and then you have to wait for the next season, and then do the same. So that temporal part is not going away, and it's always a challenge through those very specific operational challenges. But something for probably a seminar, we'd love to connect with you and maybe build out a seminar where you could present some of the things that you've been finding through your research and your work and your historic and current connections with the seed industry. I also wanted to foreshadow, Alan, I don't want to pigeonhole you here, but you prepared a bunch of slides on tomato breeding if we couldn't get enough questions and discussion to use up the time. And with your permission, I'd like to just show a few of them and then say we'll do a webinar on tomato breeding in the future that we can invite people to. Is that all right with you?
Sure, that's just fine.
Yeah, that's my way of saying I won't pigeonhole you and then pigeonholing you. So my apologies.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Tomiko. Much appreciated. So Alan was going to talk to us again about how to generate, varieties, and a lot of beautiful pictures here and the things that get chosen. And so just to show a little bit of what you're in for if you join us for Alan's presentation on tomato breeding. So I guess with that, thank you to everyone for joining and sharing and participating. We will post online the recording of this webinar, and so hopefully people who weren't able to attend or had difficulty attending given internet connectivity issues can access it on their own time and watch, or also let others know who they think might be interested. Georgia, any closing comments from yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you, Brian and Alan and everyone who joined today. And just to follow up also on what Dr. Tomiko said is, we're hoping that this is the first of many webinars. This is also a larger initiative of us starting to try and create learning networks between our partners, and to create, sort of just open forums where we can discuss things of importance with each other. So if you have any questions or comments or thoughts on whether that's questions that you had directly related to this webinar, if you have ideas of topics that you would like covered in the future, if you have ideas on how partners can get connected with each other in other ways, please reach out to me. I think everybody has my email, but it's georgia.beasley@seedprograms. You can also .org. You can also email us at info, our info email. We would love to hear from you, and we're sort of collecting, thoughts and ideas to make this a collaborative effort. So thanks for joining our first one, and we look forward to future ones.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.